The Twisted Tales of Spike McFang. This is a game I have waited a very exceptionally long time to play and talk about, and I'm very excited to because this is a game that held my interest for a very long time. I've always wanted to know more about this. And a large part of that is because in my almost 30 years of playing Super Nintendo games, this is like the single most obscure and possibly rare Super Nintendo game released in North America. This is a game I have seen all of one copy of, the one that arrived on my doorstep thanks to my lovely, very thoughtful and generous girlfriend who had happened to get it for me as a present. And I was very excited to play this, and while this game has certainly a fair number of problems, I'm still very fond of this game. But let's talk about this proper. Now the story follows Spikle Alucardian Draculoso McFangula III Esquire, but his friends call him Spike, on a quest to save the world. It starts out near a simple summer camp when he receives word that the entire world has been turned upside down. His father, Dracuman, because Dracula reference, has been disposed of, and his kingdom in tatters. His friend Camellia, because Carmilla reference, her kingdom too is under siege, and this entire world is going to basically be under the command of the evil Von Hessler, because Van Helsing reference? Seriously, this game has a lot of goofy literary references. If this isn't in the Japanese version, at the very least the localization team was having a lot of fun with it, but I'm kind of thinking that it was probably like this in the Japanese version. This game does not take itself seriously at all, and it sets the tone for the rest of the game. It is a jaunty, goofy romp in this really bizarre world. However, our boy Spike here, he is a good many things. He's a magician, a vampire magician before Agent 47 decided to bring it back as reference to this guy, a master of spinning hat throwing, 25 years before Mario decided to make it look cool, thus making Mario look like a total chump, a lover, and of course, a lawyer. But there is one thing our boy Spike is not, and that is a fighter. And that's why he starts this game off at fighting camp, when he receives word that Von Hessler has gotten a little too big for his britches and has decided to take over the world. However, despite his friend Camellia asking for his aid, he refuses because he doesn't want the deposit on his summer camp to go to waste. Again, the writing in this game is absolutely impeccable, and I love it. Now, unfortunately, that's kind of where the writing for the most part ends. There isn't really a lot of characterization. This is almost a strictly gameplay sort of affair. In between chapters, you will get a little bit of dialogue back and forth between the villains, and occasionally you'll get like some banter between your characters, but for the most part, that's it. And from a story perspective, it's definitely very lacking. However, what you do get here is just brilliant. I just wish there was so much more, and that is a continuing theme with a lot of this game. Now, when you first look at the game, you might immediately think Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I know I certainly saw that there was at least some influences or at least stylistic similarities, and that's why the first thing that really surprised me about this game is it wasn't an open world affair. It was a small chapter-based linear romp. Basically, every chapter starts you out at a starting point, usually a town where you can stock up on items, and then you go into a dungeon, you slowly work your way towards a boss, you beat the boss, and you move on. And that's kind of it. And I really want to emphasize the linearity because it feels like the game is sort of at odds with itself a little bit in this regard. Because while it being a linear affair is not inherently a problem, what is that this game does at certain points feature branching routes. For example, you could like walk up the stairs in the first castle, walk left or walk right, and each will take you to a different room. However, like all these branching routes, one of these is a complete dead end with no benefit to going there, and the other takes you forward. It feels like development-wise, they kind of wanted to make this a little bit more sprawling, a little bit more explorative, and reward your exploration. But here, because there's alternate paths that literally go nowhere for no reason, it just kind of punishes you and wastes your time. And that is unfortunately not ideal, especially if this game was indeed supposed to be a huge explorative endeavor. And while exploration is not necessarily good, combat is very, very interesting. It's certainly highly nuanced. It has its problems, but I kind of enjoy it. Spike has two main moves in his attack arsenal. He can spin himself around, which has very short range but can hit any opponent within that range multiple times, and if you're on the same level as your opponent, you can pretty much take him out in one go. The problem is that if you go for that full spin attack, you actually dizzy yourself, and this leads to some problems. Now, first and foremost, it means that you can't control your character, but it also means that you're almost stationary, but you have a moving hitbox, which means not only can you not get out of the way of attacks, you're actually more susceptible to getting hit than ever, which means you kind of have to really understand the benefits to using it and when to, and the nuance to that is actually quite brilliant. However, it does lead to some frustration in some parts, especially when you're in a moment of, okay, I'm in a very dangerous situation, but if I spam spin, I'm going to do the most damage ever, and I might be able to scrub out a win. Oh god, I missed a little bit just because my hitbox is too small, and now I'm dead. Yeah, that happens a little bit too often in this game. Spike's other ability, which is likewise very nuanced, as I mentioned, is putting Mario to shame by taking off his awesome hat and throwing it. And in doing so, he not only creates a projectile attack, but he actually gives himself a few different maneuvers inherent to it if you're creative. When you throw your hat out, it sort of boomerangs back to you. However, if you modify your movement, then it starts to follow you slowly until it gets back to your head, and if you do this properly, you can actually give yourself sort of a shield. Granted, it's one where you have to constantly move and it's a little bit awkward, but you can use this defensively as well as offensively, and once you master this, you can actually get through levels a little bit more comfortably. In addition, while your hat's out, you can still do your spin attack, which gives you even more defensive options. It's really clever, and I love it. There's also running and jumping, which allows you to avoid some traps and obstacles, but again, it's a little bit tricky here and there, though the hitboxes seem to be a little bit more forgiving for jumps, or at least the invincibility you get from it is. And that's not the end of Spike's different abilities. Going back to the beginning, when you start out in a town, there are shops where you can buy things. One shop happens to give you different hats as well as tomato cards because, you know, you're a vampire, you need to have tomato juice to heal up, fair enough. But the different hats will give you different effects. Now, from what I can tell, the different hats don't seem to give you any combat damage bonuses, but they do have additional effects. One will throw slightly further, the other will force your hat to go in sort of a sine wave pattern, giving it a bigger hitbox, that sort of thing. Small little tweaks that make your hat far more effective as you go. The other shop, however, which is sort of more what I'm focusing on, is a random gacha shop where you can put in 20 coins and get a randomized card. Now, randomized cards can do a lot of different things, varying in effectiveness. You can summon up angels or random animals or random stuff to just attack your opponents. There's a few different offensive cards like that. You have ones that are kind of defensive, where Spike will turn his hat into a UFO and hide in it to allow him to avoid all damage for a short while, though he can't attack, so it's kind of a trade-off. You have one that will teleport you to the beginning of the chapter to get you out of a rough spot, which can be useful, but I'll talk about why there's a problem with that later. The thing about these cards are they seem to be sort of the main focus for your overall damage output, because while there are levels in this game and you do increase your damage output a little bit with each level, these cards just do significantly more, which is why it kind of sucks that you have to go in and basically pay for your best abilities, and you don't really actively want to use these cards on anything other than bosses, because those are where this damage boost is going to be basically necessary for your survival. Again, it's a bit of a problem that I'm gonna discuss in a minute. Now, there is one other combat option, sort of. After the first chapter, you gain allies. The first one being Von Hessler's son, Rudy, and then after that, Camellia. And these characters are weird, because I feel like these are supposed to be like AI companions that actively attack your opponents, but for the most part, the only damage they tend to do is if your opponent just sort of walks into them, then they take damage. I mean, on the bright side, you're not escorting these guys because they have like limited health or anything, but on the other hand, for the most part, they're not even useful. Now, I know what you're gonna say, well, that's for player 2, right? Well, no, and also yes. If you go in and input a special password with your controller, then player 2 can control one of these guys, but that requires a password. That's not inherent to the base game experience, at least as far as I consider it. So these guys are basically forced to just follow around and not do much. Now, there is one way to actually get these guys to be useful, and going back a step, That's with cards. There is a special companion attack card you can get that actually makes them relatively not worthless. Unfortunately, it being a card is an expendable resource and it's totally random whether or not you get one. And of course, cards do not drop anywhere in the game. There's not really any sense of treasure or anything you can find. So unless you happen to grind a whole bunch for money and then just buy a whole bunch of random cards at the start, your odds of your teammate actually being useful to you are slim at best. And again, you want to save those cards for the boss because this game, it ain't balanced well. This is my biggest problem with this game. The bosses are a huge difficulty spikle. And while there is a neat little feature that most of the time you will actually be informed ahead of time through a character you run into what the boss's actual level will be, thus giving you sort of an idea of how to prepare, they aren't balanced right. The first boss, I actually went in with a level advantage, and I died on that boss so many times. I can't even tell you. If you go to my first impressions video, I think I spent like half an hour on that boss and I still didn't beat it. On my own time playing through this game, I think I spent 2 hours just running into this thing and trying to kill it. And that is with a level advantage. For perspective, they have 4 health bars, as indicated by the large number 4 next to their garlic icon, which is their health, which is funny. And those 4 health bars, indeed, in turn, contain 4 little garlic hearts each. At this point, I had 5 health bars, as represented by the tomatoes, again, vampire, and each of those contained 4 smaller tomatoes, individual hearts, if you will. Now the thing is, attacking my opponent, each one attack I could do on them would take out 1/4 of a garlic. So to get rid of 1 health bar, I would have to hit them 16 times. To get rid of all 4, well, some quick math will tell you that's 64. Now that's a bit of a big number, but you know, that's manageable if you understand the enemy's pattern. First of all, 1 hit from them will take out 2 of my hearts, thus effectively saying that they do 8 times as much damage as I do to them, which in turn, again if we're doing math, gives us about 10 hits, which does sound a little generous until you realize there's not a ton of invulnerability in this game, and enemies attack fast and have sometimes questionable hitboxes, especially with the bosses. But also when I get their health down to 0, oh, what's this? They power up and get full health again because they have a second form, which fully healed herself, gave her significant range increases to her attack, as well as giving her more invulnerability and an attack that had a variable hitbox that wasn't consistent. So even having a perfect strategy on how to counter her, it's bad. Like, it's really bad. And again, that was me with a level advantage. Just going back to the most basic part of this fight, it would take 4 hits to get rid of 1 of their hearts. In 1 of their hits, they take out 2 of mine. That is not balanced properly. Now, I know what you're probably going to say. Well, why didn't you go out and grind more? Well, the thing about grinding is that's not exactly balanced either, because the experience you get from your opponents isn't really enough to make it beneficial. I don't have the numbers immediately on hand, but I think my opponents dropped something like 3 to 5 experience per kill, and I needed something like 800 experience to get the next level. It was not good. I could run through the entire level multiple times and still probably not get another level before this fight. Ultimately, it feels like leveling up the amount of experience required to level up, as well as the amount of experience enemies drop, and the sort of requirements to make a fight remotely fair without just spamming cards is entirely out of whack. And that makes the bosses really frustrating, especially because they are such a big difficulty spike. And the saddest thing of all is, if you ignore that, the adventure is actually really bloody enjoyable, and for what it is, really without too many flaws. The only other flaw I could really see in this game is that there aren't really any ways to heal up. Short of going back to the start and buying tomato cards to heal yourself up, the only other way to get health in this adventure is to get tomatoes from opponents. They show up in little tiny tomatoes, which equate to 1 heart basically, or large tomatoes, which give you 1 big tomato, which is a health bar of 4 hearts. The thing is, these things drop really, really scarcely. Drops in this game are not guaranteed, and they are not terribly common. Health ones even less so. And again, unless you go back to the beginning and buy a bunch of cards to heal yourself up, or talk to your little steward guy at the beginning, you have no way of actually healing yourself. And these dungeons aren't huge by any means or measure, but again, enemies do a lot of damage, and without any way to actively recover on your adventure, it really hurts, especially since there are characters that you can run into on your quest that tend to give you save points, but they don't offer to heal you up. The only character who actually does heal you, again, is your steward at the beginning. It makes the adventure stressful because you kind of have to try and avoid as much damage as possible and kind of play perfectly, or else you're going back and healing up or buying a bunch of cards or really hoping for rare drops. The short version is, while the combat itself is fine given how nuanced it is and interesting and how it sort of benefits you experimenting with your movement as well as your attack mechanics, and it works really well in that regard once it clicks, defeating enemies, the rewards for doing so, and ultimately having to build yourself up are frustrating than anything. And it feels like it takes way too long to actually get anywhere in terms of leveling yourself, which in turn means fighting bosses is just frustrating given the huge difficulty spike they happen to give you. If you can get past that, the overall gameplay is tremendous, but you are probably going to spend a decent amount of time on those bosses. And this game is entirely linear, and it only has like 4 chapters, so it's not a very big game otherwise. The only thing that's really going to test your time and patience is the bosses and maybe grinding to prepare for them, which really sucks because my last real criticism about this game is I just want more. It's a fun story. It's not terribly deep, and that's kind of a shame, but it's a really upbeat, goofy adventure. You're fighting cloves of garlic because you're a vampire, and cat girls in giant suits of armor because reasons. There are so many brilliant, clever enemies that you get to fight, and honestly, if they just balanced it out a little bit better, and they just added more, this would be one of the best games on the system without a doubt. Unfortunately, those are not the cases, and that just makes it a very fun, memorable adventure that happens to contain equal parts frustration, and it really pains me to say that. Now, the overall presentation to The Twisted Tales of Spike McFang is tremendous. First of all, like I said, all the enemies are goofy, full of personality, and play off the fact that you're a vampire in this sort of really funny, quirky, gothic horror sort of adventure. Everything is decently detailed and full of personality. This game likes to use bright colors and likes to use a lot of visual humor in this game. Even though this game doesn't happen to feature a lot of inherent storytelling, it really is more the adventure of your experience along the way rather than the story they're telling. And in that regard, it's pretty great because there's just so much visual humor, so many quirky enemies, and so much fun to be had, and it is an absolute visual feast on this adventure. And audio-wise, this might be one of the most noteworthy Super Nintendo games I think I've ever experienced because the entire soundtrack in this game is jazz. Like, it's just, for the most part, entirely just upbeat, goofy jazz that totally fits the quirky theme of this game. And then you get moments where it's sort of more somber, but it's still like really nice sort of lounge music. Everything about this feels like some kind of Broadway production in terms of sound design, and it just feels like you could hear anything on this soundtrack in any sort of lounge or anything, and it fits perfectly. The soundtrack is really unique and clever, and I love it. There's just nothing else that's quite like it on the Super Nintendo. Because of that, ultimately the presentation to this is almost in its own way a reason to own this game, because genuinely it is one of the most unique experiences on the Super Nintendo, and it is polished to an absolute shine. The adventure may have some issues, but the writing and the presentation are just AAA class right here. It is amazing. Now, if you want a copy of The Twisted Tales of Spike McFang, well, going back to the start, remember how I said that this was kind of like one of the most obscure and possibly rare Super Nintendo games released in the West? Yeah. In my entire history of collecting and studying the Super Nintendo and stuff, I have only ever run into one person who's even heard of this game. The cheapest one I'm seeing right now is shipping included about $150. And yeah, this game is very hard to find, very rare. That said, it is a tremendous game, but do I recommend it? Well, here's the tricky part. Yes, kinda, but also no, kinda. It's a tremendous, goofy adventure with tons of comedy, tons of sight gags, brilliant writing when there is some, as well as some of the best and most unique presentation you will have on the Super Nintendo. You also have an amazing adventure, even if it is wildly unbalanced and has all sorts of difficulty issues with the bosses, and this game makes grinding wildly unpalatable. But even so, as an adventure, it is one of the most interestingly written Super Nintendo games I've ever seen. And the adventure, the enemies, the animations, everything about it is just a bright, goofy adventure, and it is one that I think is an absolute must-have, especially considering how unique and memorable the presentation to this game is. Everything about this game screams memorable aside from the gameplay itself, because of its difficulty spikes and the insane amount of grinding required to make this gameplay remotely balanced. And that's a damn shame, because as an experience, The Twisted Tales of Spike McFang is a tremendous must-have recommendation for the Super Nintendo, but the thing that absolutely kills any recommendation, again, is the rarity and cost of this game. I do, once again, have to give a huge thank you and shout out to my girlfriend for providing me a copy. This was a very special game that I had been hunting for a very long time, and to play it, despite the fact that there was a lot of frustration with the difficulty, was still one of the most memorable games on the Super Nintendo, I feel, and this game is an absolute treasure of an adventure. It's just a shame that it never got a proper sequel that expanded its gameplay and maybe balanced it better, because that's really all this game needs to be one of the most necessary games in any Super Nintendo collection. I think it's safe to say that The Twisted Tales of Spike McFang, everyone's favorite magician vampire who is the greatest hat-throwing adventurer who could ever live, is truly a magical adventure for the books.